Shalom. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Eikev, beginning in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 7 and verse 12. As Moshe continues to prepare the children of Israel for their entrance into the land, our Parsha focuses on the importance of fulfilling God's commandments. And it opens with the description of the reward that will follow for observing the commandments. This portion is named for the second word in its first verse, Eikev. The verse reads, "This shall be the reward, because Eikev you hearken to these ordinances, and you observe and perform them." We translate this word Eikev as because or when, in order to preserve the meaning, in order to allow the meaning of the verse to flow naturally, because the truth is that if we were to read the word Eikev as it appears in our verse, according to its literal translation, it wouldn't make any sense at all, because Eikev is actually the Hebrew word for heel, as in the heel of the foot. So what is this word doing here? And how does it fit into this sentence, which highlights the reward for observing the divine commandments? Now, our sages understand this unusual usage as an outstanding example of the subtle and profound messages conveyed between the lines in Torah. Commenting on this verse, Rashi very famously cites the tradition that Torah uses the word Eikev, meaning heel, as a signal that stresses how careful we need to be to observe even those commandments that people tend to consider to be minor, to be of lesser importance. Mitzvot that we perhaps take advantage of and tread or trample with the heel underfoot to walk all over them, so to speak. After all, who are we to decide which divine commandments are more important than others in God's eyes? All of the mitzvot should be observed out of a motivation of love and reverence for God. But a person might tend to prefer some over others, perhaps concluding arbitrarily that some are of lesser value, or perhaps deciding on one's own that I'm only willing to accept what is logical to me. So on a simple level of meaning, according to this interpretation, the word Eikev alludes to those commandments that we might not think are as important as others. And Moshe is here reminding Israel that the covenant of the commandments is binding in its entirety, as he tells us here in chapter 8 and verse 1. "The entire commandment that I command you today, you shall perform, so that you may live and increase and come and possess the land that Hashem swore to your forefathers." Now, the interpretation of the word Eikev, as I've just summarized it, is quite well known. But today, I would like to talk to you about some of the deeper implications of this word. And I want to go in some different directions with you to explore some of the profound levels of meaning and messages that Torah is teaching us through the use of this one unusual word, Eikev, meaning the heel. The truth is, it's a word that carries such awesome significance that understanding it correctly can change our lives. So open up your heart. So what's the heel really all about, and what does it matter? Ostensibly, we might consider it as an inconsequential part of the body. So firstly, we need to understand just how important the heel is. So let's start out with a view from the ground. Our heels are down at the lowest point, bringing our feet to touch this earth at ground zero, at the very bottom of the human body. But the thing is, the heels are so important, the entire body rests on them, and so they're one of the most sensitive points, both physically and spiritually. So please open up your heart in the deepest way. There's a very deep teaching of Torah that all souls are part of the original soul that God placed in Adam, that God breathed into Adam, the father of all humanity. Every soul that ever lived or lives or is destined to be born are all included in the great soul of Adam, which encompassed all future generations. Our souls are all a part of his soul. So all the generations that have lived in the world, in essence, form a spiritual structure. Now, over time, these souls are revealed in different generations, and each generation reveals a different aspect of this one great primordial soul. Now, the earliest generations correspond figuratively to the head of Adam, and then the heart of Adam, and the latter generations to the heel. What does this mean? This generational descent from head to heel corresponds to the degenerating spiritual stature of the generations. We are currently in the very last generations preceding the Messianic era. In this sense, we are the ones completing the entire structure. The souls work their way down, as it were, throughout the ages, and those earlier generations were far greater than us. They were like the head of Adam, because those earlier generations possessed greater spiritual clarity and connection to God. The later generations, including or especially our own, correspond to the heel, because in these times, spiritual sensitivity is at its lowest. The descent from head to heel over the course of history represents a gradual diminishment of spiritual greatness, with our generation, the heel, being the lowest in terms of spiritual capacity and achievement. And therefore, open up your heart deeper still, the sages say, we ourselves are called the generation of the heel. And these times, this era in which we live, is known as the footsteps of the Messiah. In Hebrew, ikvata de Mashiach, which actually literally means the heels of the Messiah. But lest the notion of being the heel makes you feel marginalized or diminished, it makes you feel like a proverbial heel, don't fret. You need to know that being the heel is an awesome privilege and responsibility. The Holy Baal Shem Tov taught that living as we are in this time, in the generation of the heel, our actions are of paramount importance. Because just as the heel supports the entire body, our generation holds the potential to bring the final redemption. Now, for those who are familiar, this concept is deeply connected to the Kabbalistic idea that the heel represents the lowest sphera, divine attribute or emanation, that of Malchut, sovereignty, which is the point where the divine will is fully expressed in the physical world. The Holy Baal HaTanya spells it out. He explains that the divine purpose of creation is to create a dwelling place for God in the lowest realms. The heel generation, though spiritually lower, has the unique task of bringing God's presence into the most physical and mundane aspects of this world. This is why the era of the footsteps of the Messiah is so significant. It's when the divine light will finally be revealed in its fullest expression. Our sages describe the period before the coming of the Messiah as a time of great spiritual decline, when truth will be absent from the world, and hypocrisy and immorality will be the hallmark of the day. That description of the generation of the heel seems to aptly describe our own times, wherein negative forces openly combat the truth and seek to conceal it, and spiritual sensitivity is indeed at an all-time low. However, the same sages also emphasize that it's precisely in this lowly state that the greatest potential for redemption lies. To paraphrase Dickens, these days are literally the worst of times, yet the best of times. In fact, the great Maharal of Prague, in his work Netzach Yisrael, explains that the degradation of the final generations is necessary for the ultimate redemption to transpire. Just as the heel is the point of contact with the ground, he writes, so too, our generation is the point where the spiritual and physical worlds will finally merge, leading to the coming of the Mashiach. So in summary so far, the heel generation is given the task of completing the work of all previous generations, bringing the divine presence fully into our world. Even though our generation might seem spiritually weak, it's precisely this generation that has the merit to bring about the final redemption, as we are literally standing in the footsteps of the Messiah. All this is contained within this single awesome word, Eikev. But open up your heart much, much deeper, because there is a very deep idea in Torah study. And that is, the first time that the root of a particular word appears in the Torah, that is its spiritual source. And it's this first appearance that contains and conveys the deepest secrets of the word. So whenever we want to understand the deepest meaning conveyed by a particular word, it's important to examine the first time that that word appears in Torah. The first occurrence of the root ayin kuf bet in the form of Eikev is found at the beginning of the book of Genesis in chapter 3 and verse 15, where God said to the serpent, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." That verse proclaims to us that an ongoing struggle over what I can only call control of the heel began in the Garden of Eden, after Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. That's when the primordial serpent receives this curse. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And that set the stage for the ongoing battle between humanity and the forces of evil, that is, the negative forces which man brings upon himself through disobeying God's commandments, as symbolized by the serpent in the Garden of Eden. The heel, being the lowest part of the body, is vulnerable, yet it's also the foundation that supports everything. And so indeed, Our sages interpret this verse in Genesis 3:15 as a reference to the beginning of the cosmic struggle between the forces of holiness and impurity, between good and evil. The serpent represents the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, which seeks to undermine human stability by attacking the heel, that is, the point of least spiritual sensitivity. The heel is the point of vulnerability, but again, it's also the place where ultimate victory can be achieved. And the verse in Genesis foretells that the head of the serpent, representing its intellectual and strategic power, will ultimately be crushed by the forces of holiness. Midrash expounds that while the forces of evil, represented by the serpent, may strike at humanity's heel, humanity has the power to crush the head of the serpent, symbolizing ultimately the triumph of good over evil. But keep your heart open, as deep can be. Continuing, in the book of Genesis, from the Garden of Eden, we soon find this struggle of the heel once again taking center stage, this time figuring prominently in the birth of the two brothers, Jacob, called in Hebrew Yaakov, and Esav. Yaakov's name itself is derived from the word Eikev, heel. And on the simplest level of understanding, Yaakov was named because of the circumstances of his birth, as Genesis 25:26 relates about him. After that, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esav's heel. But this is not merely the description of a physical action, but of a spiritual dynamic, which began in Rivka's womb and is symbolized by the act of Yaakov grasping the heel of Esav, prophesizing the ongoing struggle between the opposing forces of good and evil that will play out throughout history through the descendants of Yaakov and Esav. Because they are the next stage, manifesting the dichotomy that began in the Garden of Eden, embodying the eternal conflict between spirituality and materialism. Jacob's mission, which he bequeathed to his descendants as a legacy, is to elevate the material world, to bring it under the influence of holiness, and to ensure that the spiritual prevails over the material. And thus his name proclaims his connection to all that we are discussing, the heel generation, the footsteps of the Messiah, and the ancient struggle that began way back in the Garden of Eden. Esav, like the serpent, represents the material world, physical power, and the profane, while the younger brother Jacob represents the spiritual truth of Torah and the pursuit of holiness. Yaakov grasps Esav's heel precisely because his descendants are divinely tasked with grasping and ultimately overcoming Esavian materialism. They are given the mission of preventing Esav from becoming the dominant force in the world. Rivka knew all of this. She was told that this struggle will continue throughout all the generations, only to find its ultimate resolution in the Messianic era, when it will reach its ultimate tikkun. So Yaakov's very name reflects both this struggle and the ultimate mission of his descendants, the people of Israel, to grasp and elevate the physical world, overcoming the forces of materialism and impurity through the unfolding of history leading to the Messianic era. Our own heel generation, as we described earlier, will bring about the final rectification by overcoming the materialism and physicality of Esav and changing the receptivity and direction of the world towards spiritual illumination, thus helping to prepare for the arrival of the Messiah. This is why the Messianic era is referred to as the footsteps of the Messiah, ikvata de Meshicha, indicating that the final rectification will occur precisely at the level of the heel. The Holy Arizal teaches that the heel corresponds to the end of the spiritual process, wherein divine energy openly manifests in the physical world. The battle between Jacob and Esav is thus a struggle over who will control this final stage in the climax of world history, whether it will be dominated by holiness or by the forces of impurity. In this context, Jacob, grasping Esav's heel, represents the effort to bring the divine light into the most material aspects of the world, to ensure that even the heel is sanctified. This is also alluded to in Yaakov's name, the idea that the ultimate tikkun will occur in the Messianic era when the heel becomes the foundation of a redeemed world. Now we can begin to see how everything that we are talking about now, that everything that we are learning about, is connected. Our Torah portion of Eikev, which speaks about meticulously keeping God's commandments, even the seemingly insignificant ones, the serpent's bite in the heel, and Yaakov's grasping the heel of Esav. As we have learned, as the lowest part of the body, the heel represents the material aspects of existence which are often seen as distant from spirituality. By grasping Esav's heel, Yaakov is asserting that the spiritual will ultimately prevail over the material. It's also important to remember that the struggle between Jacob and Esau is not only external, but also internal, reflecting the battle within each person between their higher and lower inclinations. The Baal Shem Tov taught that the task is for each one to grasp the heel of their own Esav, meaning to control and elevate their material desires and inclinations to serve a higher purpose. If we can focus on elevating the heel aspects of our own lives, those areas which, as Rashi taught us, may seem minor or less important, and thus we trample them underfoot, in this way we can bring about our own personal spiritual rectification. Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin writes in his masterful work, Pri Tzadik, he writes that the ultimate tikkun involves transforming the heel from a point of vulnerability into a source of strength. In the Messianic age, the material world will no longer be a source of spiritual danger, but will instead be fully integrated into the service of God. This is the final victory of Jacob over Esau, where even the most physical aspects of existence are sanctified. Thus, Yaakov's grasping of Esau's heel is not only a symbol of the ongoing struggle, but it's also a symbol of the promise of ultimate rectification. In the end, this struggle will culminate in the ultimate tikkun of the Messianic era, and the heel, once the point of vulnerability, becomes the foundation of stability and strength in the Messianic era. It will become the foundation of a sanctified world. Open up your heart deeper than ever before in your whole life. It is in the heel, exactly where we are at now, the lowest and most vulnerable part. It's there that the potential for final victory lies. The concepts of the generation of the heel and the footsteps of the Messiah beckon to us that despite what we may perceive as the low spiritual state of our time, this is the very time of tremendous potential for redemption, and we have the opportunity to complete the work of all previous generations. And our actions, our efforts to bring holiness into this world are critical in bringing about the ultimate redemption, fulfilling the divine plan that began with Adam and will culminate with the coming of the Messiah.